Hello and welcome to this Photoshop for Photographers video where the subject is the adjustment brush in Adobe Camera Raw. Now this tool can be thought of as one of those strategic tools, those we select to continue our manipulation after we've dealt with the global changes within our image. Let's take a look at how the adjustment brush works with the image I've opened up in Camera Raw. When I go to the top of the screen and I select the tool, if you look over on the right hand side as I click the adjustment brush, all of the options for the brush appear on the right hand side. I'd like to take a look down at the extreme bottom right at these four controls, because these are the four which control the brush you can currently see on the screen. The first of those is the brush size, but you'll notice of course as soon as I leave the screen I lose the brush. So to increase or decrease the size, you can see that we have to come back on to the image itself to see what we've selected. So it's much more convenient to change the size of the brush using those square bracket keys to the right of the letter P, so that if and when we want to zoom in to the image to work on a certain area, then we can drop the brush size down to make it easy and more appropriate to do the editing we wish to do. Now let me bring the size of the brush up a bit using those square bracket keys. You can see it's made up of two rings. The inner ring is the solid part of the brush. The gap between the inner ring and the outer dotted one is the amount of softness in the edge of the brush, or feather as we call it, from the slider on the right hand side. If I move the feather up to its maximum, there you can see we've got a greater area of feather in the brush, and if I take it right the way down, then we'll only see, well, I think we can just about see two rings, but almost only one. Generally speaking, I would work with this at a setting of around 50, not cast in stone, but that's certainly a good starting point. Let's take a look at the flow and density together by asking a question: what's the difference between the two? Well, the best way I can think of to describe them is like this. Imagine we had a hose pipe which was on full power and it's squirting out jet black ink. Now we can reduce the flow to the hose pipe and the jet black ink may be just trickling out of the end, but the ink is still jet black. Whereas if we had the hose pipe at full flow but we reduce the density really low, then although the pressure's high, the density of the ink is very low. It's now not black. That's the best way I can think of to describe it. But personally, I've never ever found a need to use both of these options at the same time. So I tend to leave the density at 100 and I adjust how aggressive or not my brush is via the flow. Hence the suggestion that we start off with the flow setting of 5 and in some cases even a little bit less than that. One of the things you'll notice about this particular tool is when you select the adjustment brush, any previous settings you were using here will still be in place. Let's just assume for the moment that I was playing around with exposure before. So although I have selected my brush, I've not done anything with it yet. So what I'm going to do here is just start painting over the surface. Now what I'm doing, I'm painting with a partially soft brush, as you can see by the edge, but you can also see I'm painting in quite a high degree of underexposure here. But by starting that painting you can also see a pin. Now we can have as many different adjustment brushes with different settings as we wish. When we do select the adjustment brush, if we find that the settings on the right hand side are completely inappropriate to the current manipulation, of course we can go over to the right hand side and reset them all manually, but we can also right click the pin and choose to reset the local correction settings. And if you look over on the right hand side, particularly at the exposure at the top, when I select it, they're all set back to the 0 position. Now this brush works from a mask. Now we can see the mask. If we go down to the bottom of the palette here, we can tick the little box, and there we can see the mask that I created. And sometimes it's useful to be able to see the mask. But it also indicates that although the brush doesn't have any adjustments within it, the brush is in fact still working. Let me take the mask away, because if I went to my exposure, for example, you can see it's still in fact working perfectly okay. If we want to add another brush with a completely different set of settings here, then we go to the new option and select it, and we can start to brush up here. And now we've got 2 pins, but of course it can only work 1 pin at a time. But as I said earlier on, we can have as many of these brushes as we wish. And now I've got 3 adjustment brushes, none of which are going to help us with our demonstration, so I need to remove them. All we need to do is to select a pin we want to remove. It will turn red. We can hit the delete key. And they're gone. There's another option here that I would just like to point out, but I think we'll cover this when we look at the graduated filter, because that tool also uses the ability to apply a colour. Now I think I'd better put a little bit of a change in here so you can see what I'm about to do. So I'm just going to make a quick adjustment. Click the colour panel, the colour picker opens, and if I select a colour, you can see how that's affecting that dark area. Perhaps if I select blue and OK and change that maybe to an overexposure, there you can see the colour much better. Now that could be quite good, but I think we'll probably use that a little more with our graduated filter. So let's look at that a little bit later on, and I'll hit the delete key to remove that pin and those changes. So the problem I have here is the areas here, 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 and maybe above as well. They're quite distracting, I think, in this particular picture. So I'm going to use my zoom tool to zoom in. I'm going to use shortcut keys for this. Control and spacebar. You can see the zoom tool appears. So I just want to get this fair size on screen. I think that's going to be okay. So we're just looking at the top right corner. I'm going to drop the size of my brush down just a little bit. Now one of the things we need to do just before we use this tool is maybe just to think what we want to do. I want to deal with the highlights here, but probably a little bit of exposure too. Remembering we can always change this later, so what I'm about to do here isn't cast in stone. So I'm just going to drop my highlights down, and let's reset that back to 0, and I'll drop that back to about that point too, because now I can start to paint over that area, and you can see how I can darken down certain areas. Now that was working rather fast for me. Now that indicates one of 2 things. Either I've put too much or reduced the exposure and highlights too much, and of course I can always temper that at any time. That's one of the great things about this tool. I've also made a mistake with the colour, demonstrating it to you a few seconds ago. I've left blue in there, but that gives me the opportunity to click it to open it up and to take the saturation completely off, and OK. But the other way we can temper how these tools work, of course, is that flow I was talking about earlier. But now I've released the pressure a little bit, let me see if this is going to work okay. Now you can see that it seems to be doing quite a nice job here. Still working a little fast for me, so I'm going to drop that down to about 3, that flow. Just so it's a little bit more measured. And can you see a little bit of a blueness coming in here? This is the great thing about the adjustment brush. Let's just move that slider a little bit warmer, And look how it balances nicely with the tones there. Let's have a go at this one here. Just taking it nice and steady. This sort of work is best done in a measured and calm fashion. It's a big mistake to get these tools working much too fast, and I may even drop that down even more to 2. It's a big mistake to try to work too fast with these tools, because what happens is they run away with us, and that's when our editing work can be seen in the picture. But as you can see, I can take quite a bit of time here, although I always work a little bit faster when I'm doing a demo because I'm conscious of using up all this video time. But there you can see it's quite easy to tone down some of the more distracting areas in the picture. And of course, if I've got an area like that I want to take down even more, I could even put another pin in place and take it down even more. That one up there is still a little bit high, and then when you start looking around the picture, you start to see other things which are just a little bit distracting. Now remember, we're working on a raw file here, so all of the changes I've made with that brush are changeable at any time. When I open this image up into Photoshop, all those changes will be saved, but I can simulate that by just clicking Done, which also locks them all into place. So if I was to come back sometime later and reopen the image, we won't see the pin. We'll see the effect of the work I've done, but we won't see the pin because we need to select the adjustment brush. But as soon as we do, we can see the pin, and if there was more than one pin, we'd see them all. I can just select the one that I want to work on, and there you get a brief look as I mouse over this at the mask. Select it, and we can start to add or remove from the adjustment brush we've made. Now perhaps we have use for the brush on the left hand side of the miner's lamp. Maybe that's getting a little too dark given the background is so dark. I like the background dark because it's going to make this stand out nicely. So what I'm going to do here is zoom in a little bit. I think that's about as far as I can go. I'm going to go to select a new adjustment brush, but I just want to think about, what do I want to do here? I want to maybe increase the exposure a little bit, maybe increase the shadow detail. So I'll just move my slider just a little bit to the right. The highlights I'm not concerned with. The shadows I'll step up a little bit. So I'm putting the changes into my brush before I've even made the mask. But now I can see exactly what I'm doing. I can make my brush. I can start to paint down this area. And I can see how effective it's going to be to just lift these tones. And as I stop working there, you can see the pin appear, but you can see I can just raise those tones. Be careful when you're doing this to make sure you don't go over the edge, but there I think we're having a nice effect, and I'll hit Ctrl-0 and you can see we've just relieved the edge there, and of course we could do a little more if we wished. Down here we've got some highlights, so we could use another adjustment brush there. I'm sure you can see the potential here. Now let's just suppose that after doing the work down the left hand side of the miner's lamp, or even the highlights over here, that I felt I had overdone it a little bit and I just wanted to back off. In other words, I wanted to take away some of the changes I'd made. Make sure you select the appropriate pin that controls the work you've done. Then you can go to the erase option, but when you select it, be aware that you may need to reset those similar to the brush you used to apply the changes, particularly the flow, otherwise you'll take away the changes far too quickly. Better to take away changes or erase them more delicately than you applied them. There's one other thing we can do with this tool. I want to zoom in to the panel here, so I'll use those shortcuts again, Control and Spacebar. Of course we can always select the zoom from the top, but I want this to be a fair size. I think that looks pretty good to me. What I'm going to do here is select an enormous brush, and I'm going to click just to anchor a pin here. But then over on the right hand side I'm going to scroll down, and in the range mask we have three options: none, which is the default; luminance, which works exactly the same way as colour basically, so I'll demonstrate with the colour. I'm going to select colour. We get a little eyedropper here. The tooltip tells us what to do. It says use the eyedropper to select colours, drag an area to select a range of colours, and press shift to add multiple samples. Okay, well, I want this gold here, and I also want that gold over there. Then I'm just going to remove that little eyedropper and come back and start painting, but I'm going to paint with my saturation at its full amount. And what you'll notice with this, as I start to paint, is it starts to, let me push up the flow as well. As I start to paint, it has an impact on the badge, of course, but have you noticed that it's not impacting the tones around the outer edge? So I don't even have to be careful here going around the edge to make sure that the colour change is kept within the panel. And of course that could be quite useful here because there are other brass areas on the lamp which may benefit from a little extra colour. Now I've gone way over the top there for demo purposes and to demonstrate the range mask, but it's pretty clever. But on this occasion I'll go back to my pin, select it and delete it, and we're back to where we left off. Now once you've been using this tool for a short while, you will develop a degree of skill in balancing the flow that you're using with the amount of change you make up here. But it doesn't even matter if you get things wrong, does it? Because you can always adjust these after you've created the mask. It really is a foolproof way of working when we're working with the adjustment brush for our strategic editing. Now, one of the problems we may have whenever we use tools such as the adjustment brush or any of the tools we would use for a more strategic editing approach is to know exactly what needs to be done. But I tend to think of it like this. I try to look at the picture and think, I need to enhance the good things about the picture and I need to subdue those that are not so good. So here we've got distractions still along here, 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 down here, here, here. So there's a good job for the adjustment brush. Maybe even up here we could really subdue the background. Then we could maybe kill a little bit of the highlights around here and then warm up the colour of the brass to really make that lamp stand out. And particularly as the lamp body seems to have a little bit of blue in there, and blue and yellow go quite well together. So everything we would be doing hopefully would be enhancing the image, subduing what's not so good, enhancing what we think are the good parts of the image. I hope you've enjoyed this video on the adjustment brush, but of course you have. You're still here and we've reached the end. How about coming along to my website at the address you can see on screen and joining my photo and audio visual forum. Get access to me and others who share your passion.